So you've seen our keynote speaker has set us up very well. There's really nothing else for the rest of you to say, I'm afraid, gentlemen. But just in the interest of fairness, I'll let you jump in. Patrick, it was pointed out the role of the private sector when I did ask a moment ago about what's new, what's different, because again, this is those of us, and I know some of us in this room are long in the tooth who might share one or two gray hairs with me, have seen this challenge addressed before for a couple of decades, and progress has been slow in expanding electrification. So as a dynamic entrepreneurial company in the private sector, can you give us an insight into what are you doing that's working, and how are you seeing the context change and evolve? Give us a reason to hope that there might be some progress.
Thanks, Vijay, and thanks, Damilola, for giving us this hope. So Sun King is distributing affordable off-grid solar kits across sub-Saharan Africa. We're installing now over 300,000 solar kits per month, almost entirely in homes that have previously had no access to electricity. This is not, for these homes, it's not as much of an energy transition as it is their first access to electricity. It's the first time they have electric light in the house, first time they can charge their phones, power other basic electronics. And as solar technology has improved over time, we're delivering bigger and bigger systems. So the Mission 300 splits this up into 5 tiers of solar kits, and we deliver tier 1 all the way up through tier 5, which means like grid parity power, multiple kilowatt hours per day. But the bulk of our systems are still very basic solar kits, and there's just a huge number of them required on the continent. So, we employ about 30,000 people, over 30,000 people across 11 countries in sub-Saharan Africa in order to install and service these kits. And it's an enormous boots on the ground effort that really is scaling very quickly. So we need to grow a lot bigger. We want to be installing over 1 million kits per month in order to meet this 300 million challenge that World Bank and African Development Bank have so greatly laid out. But we're well on our way, and along with others in the industry, there are a whole bunch of companies involved in this work. We're trying to make sure that we can make sure that there are no homes that are lacking access to electricity in the near future.
So it has been alluded to already, the interest rate challenge, and I remember, you can pick country to country, things will vary based on political risk, but the CATF, which is a leading environmental organization, Clean Air Task Force, published a report a few months ago suggesting that the interest rates in Africa are 15% points or higher differential versus global, a huge penalty, a great disincentive for obviously international capital to invest, or a much higher hurdle for returns. How do you deal with this as a private sector entrepreneur where you clearly need to deal with capital markets? What do you answer your investors? How do you adjust your expectations on returns?
So Sun King has been working on this for over 15 years. We started with dollar equity coming from abroad, and we moved into local currency debt. And then most recently, we've established some of the first local currency securitizations on the continent. So we just closed a $156 million securitization in Kenya, working with Citibank and others. So now we're bringing local commercial banks into the financing picture. I think that's absolutely essential. As you were saying, Damilola, this has to be locally financed. This has to be a locally driven sector. So bringing local currency financing means that there's not a mismatch between the inputs and the outputs, and we have the ability to deliver affordable financing for end users. If we ask a person who's buying a solar kit in rural Kenya to pay for the entire solar kit at one time, it's like asking somebody in Cape Town to pay for 10 years of electricity bills all at one time. So these systems have to be financed, and that requires local currency and it requires local capital.
I see. Welcome to our stage, Kesh. I know that I think Mamela couldn't make it, but we appreciate you coming, and apologies for bringing you on a little later. The note wasn't passed to me in time. So give him a welcome as well, Kesh Budali from Boston Consulting Group. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Well, since we have you, we're going to put you on the spot. Give us the perspective because you have an opportunity to look into companies across Africa What is the corporate perspective on this? Maybe as a demand driver, or how do you see the response from the corporate community to this challenge of expanding energy access, and not just enough for one light bulb, but really as a potential for driving economic growth and opportunity?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think from our perspective, we do see that there is interest from corporate sector. I mean, I think when it comes to ease of doing business and working in a country, I mean, if you look across Africa and this sort of sticky problem that we've seen with energy access for the last 10 years, and if you look globally, I think the world has reduced energy access by about 80%, whereas Africa stayed more or less stagnant. And I think if you're going to move into Africa and do business in Africa without having a connected population, then the business case doesn't really make sense. So there is very much a willingness for private sector to collaborate on this. Where we see that playing out much more is, through collective business platforms rather than, specific initiatives from an individual corporate, because of the economic challenges sometimes when it comes to energy access solutions. But there is willingness to engage. There are advocacy efforts that we see across the continent as well. And I think one thing that's been very interesting for us to see is that when it comes to productive uses of energy, one of the big inhibitors to energy access is the lack of demand density in many of these different rural populations. And I think where private sector sees an opportunity is that if it can anchor productive uses of energy in that space, then it almost becomes a catalyst for energy access and investments on the back of that into infrastructure that can, kill two birds with one stone, solve the energy access problem, but also drive economic growth on the back of that, and for business opportunities. Yeah.
How much do you think the failings of legacy infrastructure, whether it's blackouts, and when I was sitting here a year ago with the chairman of ESCOM, they had managed at that point successfully to overcome a period that all of you will remember in this room of brownouts and blackouts and so on. But it had driven local corporates towards acquisition of clean energy and power purchase agreements and so on, so that we've seen it, that kind of takeoff. This happened in India, my native country. The failures of the Indian grid system led to many, many corporates having supported independent power and ultimately clean power. How significant can that be as a demand driver that has knock-on effects that might actually spur on the move towards a clean energy that could ultimately help drive energy access for all?
Yeah. No, I think it's massively important. I think you mentioned India. I think India is a great example because if you look at sort of demand trajectory in India, once they had actually a liberalization of the power market, you actually see this sort of early 2000s. With the liberalization of the power market comes more price transparency, more price stability. And actually, when it comes to corporates, and you look at, for example, South Africa's situation, we have, I think, on absolute basis, one of the cheapest costs of power in the world. The problem is we've had a 970% increase over the last 13 years. And that's not predictable, that's not transparent, so that makes the business case very difficult for corporate. When you have stable power, if you look at the example of India, you see actually, with the market opening, more price transparency and basically bottoming out of tariffs. With that bottoming out of tariffs, you actually see an increase in volume growth over time. And it's, again, a virtuous cycle. And I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that there is space when there's growth for public sector participants and private sector participants. And I think when there is that mutual gain, that creates quite a collaborative environment, which is what's needed to unlock policy and infrastructure in most of these cases.
Great. Well, let's come to you. The African Development Bank has supported Mission 300. If I recall correctly, you launched a $5 billion local currency guarantee facility to support it. Can you talk a little bit about the role of an organization like yours, and maybe talk a little bit about that financing challenge that we're grappling with?
Okay, thank you very much. I think the African Development Bank has a very broad-based role because we're starting upstream at the policy end, first of all, and then all the way to financing. So with Mission 300, we've tried to capture everything. So we started with the Africa Energy Summit, getting the African leaders to actually meet and talk about the energy challenge and acknowledge that it's a #1 priority. So we signed the Dar es Salaam Declaration earlier this year. We then went to the African Union and got all the African heads of state to endorse that declaration. And that declaration actually sets out the things that we need to do. Mission 300 is based on 5 key pillars. First of all, you have to be able to have an integrated resource plan. We all have natural endowments across the continent. Countries have to use what is best for them. And least cost is actually very important because there's an affordability challenge. Our people have to be able to afford the electricity. There are many countries that are lumbered with expensive electricity, and you often find that the poorest countries, often the landlocked countries, are paying the most for their electricity. So we need to help them procure the right cost of electricity. Secondly, we recognize the role of technology. Distributed renewable energy is here to stay, and the technology is getting cheaper all the time. So about 50% of the new connections we're going to have will be distributed renewable energy. Thirdly, we're talking about regional interconnections, because we have to move away from the single buyer model. And that's one of the things that deters investment, because you're often relying on a utility that is not financially viable, and you're asking for all these government guarantees. Our governments no longer have the ability to provide these guarantees or the headroom. They're reaching their debt sustainability limits, and so we have to be able to sell electricity into regional markets. That's why we're building regional interconnectors and empowering the regional power pools to be able to trade power. So, South Africa can get green energy from Mozambique, from Zambia, from Namibia, Botswana, with very high radiation levels and wind energy potential. And then the private sector is absolutely key. But with the private sector, you have to finance in local currency to the extent possible. South Africa has one of the biggest renewable energy markets on the continent. We finance everything in rand. I don't come and offer 15, 20-year dollars. I change my dollars to rand. So we have to mobilize local savings. No continent has ever developed itself with the savings of outsiders. Californian teachers, pensioners don't give a hoot about investing in Lagos, rightly so. So the Lagosians have to mobilize their local resources. The continent has to pull its resources, and that's why we need new instruments, and I can talk about later on. And then lastly, we have to reform the utilities, because the utilities are the ultimate buyers. So I get many developers coming from all over the place. They want to sell power, but they don't understand the power system and the structure in the country. All they want is a government guarantee. I said to them, if you're looking for a government guarantee as a basis of your financing investment, then you have to go somewhere else, because you have to understand the sector. So in broad terms, it's multifaceted, and we have to address all of those things at the same time. That's what Mission 300 is about.
So I have a follow-up question for you, but I just want to advise my team. I think there's an error in the clock that I see here, if somebody could look into that. Your point about regional integration in power markets is, of course, very powerful. But I do want to observe that until Donald Trump came along with the war on globalization and so on, and tariffs, Liberation Day, I think it was called, Africa had the highest trade barriers amongst countries, right? It's something your organization has pointed out for a long time. So there's a long tradition of balkanization of markets here. Bit by bit, that's changing. What hope is there in power markets and electricity that this can change? Do you have some positive proof point you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the right word, balkanization. How can you have 54 countries with 54 different currencies?
Right.
And you have grids that are not interconnected. There's some very small countries who have no business trying to build huge power plants, when they can buy from their neighbors. I say to countries like Burkina Faso, Tunisia, you're buying electricity that is based on HFO, thermal, very expensive. There's one country I went to where the government has signed a PPA for $9 per kilowatt hour. $9, not 9 cents.
Right.
So it's a combination of different things, smart procurement, and the countries looking regionally. You have the Inga Dam. We've been talking about that for years, over 60, 70 years. 40,000 megawatts of electricity that can power the entire continent, but you're not going to finance it on the back of the local utility in DRC. You know, you need to be able to finance that on a continental basis. That's why we're working with the AU on the Continental Master Plan and the single electricity market. And it's part of the Africa AFCFTA, you know, free trade. So those barriers have to come down. And it's in the interest of our African leaders to recognize that and move away from issues of the past to integration, you know, so it's absolutely critical.
So you're hopeful. I'm glad to hear this. Olufemi, let's come to you. We've spent a lot of time at some of the macro issues, but your organization focuses on rural electrification, on individuals, on households, mini grids. Can you give us a perspective, maybe from the bottom up, how that progress is going, and maybe what challenge has to be overcome? Because again, it's a beautiful vision. I wrote a book 20 years ago called Power to the People, suggesting that this was going to be the energy vision of the future. I'm still waiting, right? I'm still waiting. Progress is coming, but it's slower than I had hoped. So tell us, what is the real challenge you encounter with what you're trying to do?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. But I think in answering that question, we need to contextualize and, you know, understand where we're coming from. So in Nigeria, I would say, in summary, it's a story of policy to action. A few years ago, we were able to ensure that on the government end, we were able to put the right mini-grid regulations, for example, to ensure that private sector could come into this space and financiers also could feel comfortable with investing into the space. We also had a situation where we had, you know, at the Rural Electrification Agency at the time, I think Damilola will tell you, we had what we call private sector contractors who typically were not designed to be developers or utilities in any way. And we've seen that transition over time just based off of the models deployed over time and the regulations that were set in place. We've also seen an increased, I would say, increased confidence in the system by financiers, just based off of the grant model, the results-based financing, and the catalytic finance model that was used in the mini-grid space. So where we are today is we are over 300 mini-grids across Nigeria, over 1 million solar home systems deployed. We also had targeted interventions in education and in health over that period. And in speaking about the challenges we've seen over time is to speak about the issue of scale and the issue of sustainability, right? What we've seen over time is that in deploying mini-grids and communities, you have to deploy at scale to be able to, you know, put together the economies of scale, to be able to surpass the affordability issue in those communities. Because if you're deploying one community at a time, you'd realize that your tariffs are too high and you can't sustain your systems for as long as you need them to. The issue of sustainability, I'll zero in on one point that Damilola mentioned earlier on. From the standpoint where I sit today, and after, you know, those 200 mini-grids, what we see today is that the communities that are experiencing the most downtime today are communities that have OEMs that don't have any footprint in Nigeria. So you can have all the warranties you want in the world, but no one's going to come all the way from wherever they sit to come to answer to some downtime issues in rural communities in Nigeria that takes hours and hours to get to. So what we've insisted on is ensuring that as we begin to scale, we ensure that OEMs have a footprint of serviceability in country to ensure that...
Will that be a mandate? Is that how you're thinking of this? You must be present if you want to sell?
So it's an issue of a technical specification. So what we do at the Nigeria Electrification Program is not to mandate any specific OEMs, is to create standards based off of data that we see on the ground as we evolve, right? And we see one key issue around the scale that we want to deploy now is having that level of serviceability on ground. It's not just about the OEMs, it's also about ensuring that there's the expertise on ground creating enabling environment for knowledge transfer, capacity building, right? Even ensuring that developers themselves are set up the right way, they have the right corporate governance
Sure.
to be able to deploy the systems in the way that we desire.
Sorry,
Okay,
just
yeah,
on
and
that
please jump in,
point,
yeah.
it's important. So no one is saying that if you don't set up a service center, you cannot bring your equipment to Nigeria. I think that's important. But if you want to be part of the Nigerian electrification project, where you're getting subsidies from government
Right.
for doing these projects, then you do. So I just wanted to,
So that's
make
good to
sure.
clarify. It's a
Yeah.
positive incentive rather than a negative
Yeah.
barrier, as
Yeah.
it were.
Can I just jump in and give credit where credit is due?
Sure.
So in terms of, policy into action, Sun King is a private sector company, but we would be nowhere without the work of NEP, the REA in Nigeria. Before NEP got started a few years ago, we were distributing only a few thousand solar home systems per month in the country. By the end of that program, just a year and a half, 2 years later, it was over 80,000 systems per month. So that's an example of how affordability is a key barrier. When those results-based financing programs came in, that unlocked the market.
Was
that
it
all
precisely
REA.
because of subsidies or something else that they did?
It was all of the above, but affordability is so key. Just bringing the cost down with results-based financing was really something that unlocked the market.
So money makes a difference. Shocking news revealed today. I see a lot of questions on the Slido, for which thank you, audience. You've risen to my challenge. The very first one, I think, comes to you, Damilola. Let me read it. You said that China is the current solution to Africa's problems. Do alternative Western projects like Global Gateway stand a chance against China? Now, that may not be exactly what you said, but why don't you pick up the ball and run with it?
We were talking about equipment and OEMs, and I think any OEM that wants to come in and be competitive in Africa will be accepted, but they have to come in at scale as well. We're seeing that apart from programs like the NEP and AFDB, just rooftop alone in Nigeria, there's about 400 megawatts coming in every 3 months. So people are looking at solar as an alternative to their generating sets. I think if there can be competitiveness in any other countries or any other sectors, please come and talk to us, because we would want to encourage that competition. But right now, we just need to be honest. It's the Chinese that are bringing things in at this scale. And more importantly, they also have vendor financing options as well. So a lot of this equipment is paid back on Femi's program when the subsidy kicks in, which makes a huge difference when we're talking about affordability and cost of financing.
Anybody else on China versus Western alternatives? Any thoughts?
No, what I'll say to that again is, let's be honest, when we speak of localization, when we speak of local manufacturing, it's not going to happen in one night or in one day, right? So see this as one step towards that, one step towards ensuring that at least we can start with things like panel assembly locally. We can start with, just assembly of these parts and ensuring that, we have less downtime in the communities that we are meant to be providing the services to. As Damilola has just said, it's public funding that needs to be accounted for. And so therefore, when the subsidies go into these communities, you need to ensure that the people who would be paying back these loans actually have the service they deserve.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm glad you're taking a pragmatic approach, because, of course, the tension at the heart of this is that the reason we have seen exponential decreases in cost in solar, in batteries, in wind and related technologies, in EVs, is because China has been able to achieve vast economies of scale through its flywheel effects of state subsidies, state capitalism, but dynamic entrepreneurship, innovation. I was our bureau chief in Shanghai for many years. I saw this at firsthand. There is the danger of protectionism as the US is going down this road, which we have argued against, that you end up with subscale and expensive technologies that is the opposite of what Africa needs. And so there is the danger. And so taking a pragmatic approach is one that I would certainly encourage, rather than insisting a replication of the wheel, everything must be done locally, would almost certainly slow down your progress, it seems to me, but just from a perspective of economics.
And I mean, everyone sometimes always forgets about the customer. When there's downtime in the customer in any of these communities, and I'm sure all Sunkin systems are quite efficient, that means people turn around and say solar doesn't work. which means they all invest in a community diesel or petrol genset, which completely defeats the point of being sustainable. So this is to make sure people don't go back to the harmful fuels that are really plaguing the continent right now. Wale?
There's a question
I
about,
was
oh,
just
sorry,
going
yes,
to
very briefly on this, yeah.
I was just going to say that, first of all, do you remember when Clinton was campaigning and it said it's the economy stupid,
Sure.
right? For Africa, energy access is our number one priority.
Right.
We don't want to get into geopolitics or where things are made or whatever.
Sure.
You know, there's an affordability problem.
Absolutely.
And people have to be able to afford the energy.
Yeah.
And the second thing, when we also talk about sustainability, it's not just sustainability in the green sense, the sustainability of the financing,
Sure.
sustainability of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
All those things are absolutely critical. So I see this over concentration on where things are made, and we're saying, look, we talk to everybody. We just want to have these things affordable and and last for a long time. So some of the terminology, we talk about energy transition, which is great, but you can't transition from something you don't have. So the terminology is not something that should dominate our conversations here.
Sure. No, of course.
The polluting countries should transition first. We just want access.
Agreed. Absolutely. Absolutely. There have been a couple of questions about alternative renewables technologies and energy technologies. So we'll just spend a moment on this. There was a question about small-scale thermal energy storage. Now, there's a huge revolution coming in thermal energy storage, coming out of both at the small scale, but even bigger scale. In a couple of weeks, you're going to see the world's largest commercial application of thermal storage in Thailand, a company called Rondo, Silicon Valley-backed thermal storage company. Sometimes people call it rocks in a box is the shorthand for it. But there are multiple competitors coming in that space. As we know, the use of heat is the single biggest human contributor to climate change gases. And whether that's in industry, a big source, or buildings. And so the ability to store could dramatically transform the economics of energy. So I just wonder if anybody wanted to take this on, whether it's in thermal storage or other just storage more generally as a complement to renewables. What are we seeing in Africa? Could there be an opportunity to leapfrog?
Well, we're seeing amazing innovation. So, for instance, we've always talked about intermittent renewable energy and the fact that you don't have base load. So obviously you need that base load power, which is often thermal in terms of gas, although it's cleaner. But what we're seeing evolving is in some markets is a combination of battery storage, solar, and wind within one project. So we know that it's more windy in the evenings, and you get your solar.
So you're able to firm the power.
So you're able to firm the power, yes. So you reduce the intermittency, and I think as the technology improves, that combination of storage and then different forms of alternative, renewable energy will become more powerful.
Yes, please.
Can I maybe just add on that? Because I think for me, when it comes to storage, there's two things that are very important. One is understanding the technology readiness level of that particular tech, number one. And number two, the role that storage plays in the system. So for example, if you look at sort of the SA power system, with about 100 gigs of renewable energy, for every additional marginal battery you build, you get zero utilization, right? Because it discharges for 4 hours. You're correcting for seasonal balancing, not day-to-day intermittency. So storage has very specific roles to play in the system. And I think whenever we look at storage, we need to have a very, very nuanced discussion around what it actually is solving for. Is it solving for day-to-day intermittency, or is it solving for seasonal balancing? And on the seasonal balancing piece, there's very little that can actually discharge for, a week or so at the time. And, the alternative today is diesel peakers and gas peakers. And I think there's very much a lot of opportunity for these innovations to come in. Small modular reactors, for example, is another one that's kind of building a little bit of momentum globally as well now. So I think that's a very important lens to think about when we look at storage.
I think to round that up is just to speak to you about a specific project which we are working on at the Nigeria Electrification Program. it's the interconnected mini grid, which is the hybrid model that brings on the grid and also the off-grid space as well. And why this is so important is that in Nigeria, as we'll know, the grid itself in certain areas, while there's grid presence, but you see that there's a lot of issues around the integrity of the equipment around those areas, and disco investment is always an issue as well. So intervening in those sectors from ground up allows us to be able to retrofit the distribution network at those specific areas, and then interconnecting with the solar and battery storage ensures reliability within that franchise area. So that just speaks to the type of projects that we.
And this is replicable then.
This is a model that's going to scale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's the
Really
key,
around
right?
Africa.
Yeah.
6
You know, the
hours
old-
of disco power and then
Yeah.
the rest coming from the mini grid.
You know, the old saying, small is beautiful, but replicably small is spectacularly beautiful. On that note, we're just out of time, so please join me in giving a round of applause to our gurus.